Emergency debate in which, and before the 3 hours starts, in which, subject only to the constraints of time and the willingness of colleagues to help each other, my main ambition is to try to maximise participation. We come to the emergency debate. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I may, I want to commend all those that were involved in trying to save the iconic Mac building in the early hours of Saturday morning. And if I may commend my honourable friend from Glasgow Central, who I know attended to make sure that her constituents were safe, and grateful thanks to the fire service and, of course, the fact that they are all safe from this great tragedy for all of us. Mr. Speaker, I would like to start by thanking you for granting time for this very important debate on the issue of the EU withdrawal bill devolution and the Sewel Convention. And I should also mention that some members of the Scottish Select Committee can't be here today as they're hearing evidence elsewhere. I know that many of the committee members would have wanted to contribute to the debate if they were here. I am grateful, Mr. Speaker, that you have granted this debate, but it is not a substitute for the absolute failure of the UK Government to allow appropriate time for debate on the withdrawal bill and the failure of the UK Government to protect devolution. Make no mistake, the events of last week demonstrated the utter arrogance and the contempt that the UK Government has for the devolved nations. Scotland's voices were silenced, whilst the Secretary of State for Scotland stood by and did nothing as the UK Government enacted a grab on the powers of the Scottish Parliament. It is notable, Mr. Speaker, that the Secretary of State for Scotland is apparently not leading for the UK Government in this debate. Can the Minister please tell us why the Secretary of State for the Scotland Office is not leading for the Government in this debate when we are discussing Scotland's devolved institutions? He is the Secretary of State for Scotland. He should face up to the debate on the power grab. He cannot hide from what has been a failure to protect Scotland and to protect devolution. Mr. Speaker, where is the leadership? He should have insisted on speaking in this debate, which is, after all, a debate about his ability, or more importantly, lack of ability, to defend the powers of the Scottish Parliament. Is the Secretary of State for Scotland yellow? Will he stand up and defend the interests of Scotland? Perhaps the Secretary of State hasn't got the gall to do so, particularly when we know that the Secretary of State for Scotland came to this House and said from the dispatch box that amendments would be put, that members of Parliament in this chamber would have the ability to discuss what was happening. None of that ever happened. Why was it that the Secretary of State for Scotland promised that we would have that engagement with members of Parliament, and he failed miserably to make sure that Scotland's MPs had the ability to debate this important issue? When he did not bother to show up last week, we saw the Secretary of State come to this chamber seeking to justify the attack on the Scottish Parliament, claiming that these are not normal times. Of course, these are not normal times, because this government is acting against the interests of the people right across the UK, rather than acting in their best interests. I will happily give way.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman. I have to say, in passing, it's a bit rich for him to say that he was gagged when he put the gag on himself by stomping out with his foot. But I do wonder what the right honourable gentleman has to say, because this is an important point that we are debating. When the architect of the convention, Lord Sewel himself, has said, "I don't think it can fairly be described as a power grab, because the legislation itself, establishing the Scottish Parliament, says quite explicitly that it doesn't affect the power of the UK Parliament to make laws for Scotland. It's absolutely clear that sovereignty rests with the Parliament of the United Kingdom."
Can I just say, order, the honourable gentleman should resume his seat. Can I just gently say intervention should be brief? Mr Ian Blackford.
I think what the honourable member has identified is that there is no defence of the rights and the powers of the Scottish Parliament. What has been proven by the events of the last week, that the Sewel Convention, sadly, is unworkable. And we've got the ridiculous situation that the Conservative government, in the teeth of the opposition from the Scottish National Party, from the Labour Party, from the Liberal Democrats, from the Greens, that have said that they do not support handing powers over to the government here in London, that the Conservative government have used the majority that they have from England to take powers back from the Scottish Parliament and the people of Scotland. That is the reality. Mr Speaker, what is happening is that the people of these islands have been dragged into political chaos, the chaos of Brexit, but is not normal. But that is no justification for breaking the convention that states very clearly that the UK government should not normally legislate and devolve matters without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. What clearly is not normal is the attack on devolution by the Conservative government. That's what's not normal. The Scottish Parliament, that many fought so long and hard to establish, is being emasculated by an anti-Tory government here in London, anti-Scottish Tory government. We used to talk of the settled will of the Scottish people, not the will of the UK Parliament to grab powers from the Scottish Parliament against the will of the Scottish Parliament. Mr Speaker, the events of last week have shaken the very stability of our devolved settlement. And then the Secretary of State informs us that, in his opinion, Scotland is not a partner in the UK, but part of the UK. Despite the fact that the Prime Minister had claimed that she wanted, and I quote, a future in which Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England continue to flourish side by side as equal partners. Mr Speaker, as equal partners. In one sentence, in the mind of the Secretary of State, we have been downgraded from a nation to a region. Not the equal partnership that the Prime Minister talked about, but a subordinate relationship. A subordinate relationship that the Secretary of State for Scotland has acquiesced in. Not so much standing up for Scotland, but trampling over our parliamentary settlement.
Mr Speaker, I thank the right honourable member for giving way. As members know, I am one of 5 former MSPs in this place, the other 4 being on the benches opposite, and I served in Holyrood for 12 years that I am very proud of. I wonder if the right honourable member would agree with me that one way out of this impasse, one way we may learn for the future, is to put in place some kind of cross-parliament arbitration system involving members of this place and MSPs. We have Mr Alex Neil in the gallery bench joining us from Holyrood today. I think that that would be one way to bring forward harmony and to work together for the good of the people of Scotland. We should learn from this.
Can I thank my honourable friend for that very useful contribution. Of course, we have the Joint Ministerial Committee, but let's not forget that the Joint Ministerial Committee did not meet for 6 months last year. It did not meet for 6 months because the Westminster Government would not engage. And my honourable friend is quite correct. One second now. My honourable friend is quite correct that there has to be respect of the Parliament, and I would argue that there has to be respect of all the political parties that represent our country, that represent our Parliament. I'll continue.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He refers to the Joint Ministerial Committee, but of course that is a mechanism for communication between governments. Surely what is required here is something I identified 15 years ago, and it is a formal mechanism for communication between parliaments, because if the governments could not be relied on to treat this seriously, then it is down to parliaments to fill that gap.
Well, can I want to give credit to the other parties in the Scottish Parliament, because there has been a strong level of engagement, and I think we need to improve and enhance upon that. And as a principle, I'm very happy with what my right honourable friend has said.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and I congratulate him on the very passionate speech he is making. Does he agree with me that when the British Government is now dealing with Wales and Scotland in these very sensitive discussions, they do well to reflect on the wise words of Voltaire, the great French philosopher, who said, "Injustice in the end produces independence."
Well, I'm very grateful to be reminded of that particular quote. But I would say to the honourable members in the government benches, be careful. Yes. Be careful, because let me finish this point. This is not about the offence which is taken in this by the Scottish National Party, because you have to take on board that you have offended the Scottish Parliament. You've offended all the parties that I talked about. Now, all of us in these benches were back home in Scotland over the course of the weekend. And I can tell you that Scotland has changed. And there's been a very strong message which has come across that people that supported devolution, people that voted for devolution in 1997, can see very clearly what is going on. However you want to try and define it, however you want to try and spin it, it is an attack on the powers of the Scottish Parliament in teeth of the opposition, of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish people. And you will pay a heavy price, as you have paid in the past, if you don't listen to the voices of the Scottish people.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. The honourable gentleman will of course recall that the Conservative Party fought tooth and nail against the re-establishment of a Scottish Parliament. And what we see in the benches opposite are apologists. Apologists.
Order. The House must calm down. There's too much noise. Mr. Grant, you're a most amiable fellow. It's very unusual to see you very animated, and it's true that you are beaming, but you and Mr. Graham are also in the process making a considerable cacophony, and I think it would be better if you would calm yourselves for now. Patricia Gibson.
Opposing the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, and we see the apologists defending the undermining of devolution itself. Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that they are hostile to the very concept of devolution in the first place?
My honourable friend is quite correct. They have form which goes back over the course of a century. If I may, I would like to make some progress, and then I will allow interventions to be made. Mr. Speaker, if the UK government has a free hand to argue and bend the rules to state when a situation is normal and not in order to undermine the Sewel Convention, then we can never, ever protect the powers of our Parliament. Westminster can do as it pleases, and we have to take it. Our Parliament in Scotland, that is supposed to be permanent, can see its powers changed at the whim of Westminster, defining times as not normal. Can the Secretary of State for Scotland not see what is wrong with that? The Secretary of State for Scotland is there to defend Scotland's interest, and he can simply put his hands up that times are not normal, and powers over fishing, over agriculture, over the environment, and so many other areas which are defined in the Scotland Act as devolved, are then taken back into Westminster. The UK government has got this wrong. Last week, Scotland recognised that there was a power grab against our Parliament. A power grab taking place when Scottish members of the UK Parliament were not even allowed to debate the matter. The devolution settlement ripped up with no debate. Where is the democracy in Scotland's Parliament having its powers stripped, and yet Scotland's MPs don't get the chance to speak? On that point, I'm going to...
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and could he take this opportunity to confirm to the House, when he says this side opposed devolution in 1997, his own party opposed devolution in 1997 because their only aim is separation of Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. And when he speaks about a power grab, can he tell me how many powers the Scottish Parliament currently has and how many it will have after this government enacts its legislation, because he knows it will be considerably more.
That was no answer. No answer.
Miles offside.
Yeah, to use a football term, miles offside. If he actually looked back on Google and he looked at what my party had done in the 1979 devolution campaign, where we vote collectively with everybody else, in 1997. And I can tell the honourable gentleman that I was tramping the streets of Scotland together with all my colleagues to make sure that Scotland could get its Parliament. And of course the Scottish people voted overwhelmingly for that Parliament, and one of the reasons they did so is because we had suffered so badly from the years of a Thatcher and a Major government that destroyed communities up and down the land, and it's little wonder that the Tories then paid a price when they were wiped off the political landscape in Scotland. And what we see today is that the Scottish Conservatives are behaving exactly as they did in the past, and I make this prediction: you will pay a price again, because what you've done is you have stabbed the Scottish Parliament and the people of Scotland in the back by taking these powers back. Mr. Speaker, Scotland is watching, and it is not just the supporters of the SNP who are alarmed. Those that cherish our Parliament are outraged by the attacks on Scotland's Parliament. It's really, I have to say, it is illuminating, the behaviour that we're seeing. We should have a respectful debate, which others have called for. I will happily say to members that I am generous in allowing interventions, as I take from all sides of the House, but this behaviour of braying and shouting does nobody any favour, and you really ought to, the members on the government benches really ought to think about their behaviour and how this comes across to the people of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, the mood in Scotland has changed. There is a widespread recognition that the Conservatives have reverted to type and they're attacking devolution. Nay, they are attacking the interests of the people of Scotland. I will give way.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way. Last week, when we divided on the Lord's amendments, this side of the House voted for more powers for the Scottish Parliament. You voted against. The SNP, Mr. Speaker, voted against. They voted against additional powers for the Scottish Parliament. We voted for more powers for the Scottish Government. They voted against those powers.
Dear. I would simply say that he should listen and watch what the reaction is in Scotland, because everybody knows that what he and his colleagues did last week was go through the lobbies to vote to strip powers from the Scottish Parliament and do it without having a debate in this place. He really ought to be ashamed of himself. Let's remind ourselves, since the Tories like to talk about referendums, that 74% of those that voted in our referendum in 1997 voted for a Scottish Parliament. Our Parliament, it belongs to all of us. We should not forget that since a Home Rule Bill introduced into this Parliament in 1913, right up to 1997, the Tories opposed devolution. The Tories have form in standing up against the Scottish Parliament. The remarks from the Secretary of State for Scotland that we are not a partner within the UK is simply a confirmation as how he sees Scotland's place. It is little wonder that he fails to stand up for Scotland as a country, fails to stand up for our Parliament. He sees us as subservient. That's the nub of the problem, and that's why the Secretary of State for Scotland needs to go. The Secretary of State, quite simply, is unfit for the office which he holds. He can't fight Scotland's corner because he won't fight Scotland's corner. By ignoring the Scottish Parliament during the passage of the EU withdrawal bill, the UK Government has risked the security of the devolution settlement. Mr. Speaker, this is an extremely serious development. Well, Section 28(7) of the Scotland Act 1998 confirms that Westminster retains its unlimited sovereignty. The devolution settlement provides through the Sewel Convention that the legislative power will not be used if there is disagreement and the devolved legislators do not give consent. Mr. Speaker, there has been no agreement. The Scottish Parliament voted by 93 votes to 30 not to consent to the EU withdrawal bill. Why didn't the Secretary of State for Scotland stand up for the Scottish Parliament? Why doesn't he get up now and tell us that he will stand up for the rights of the Scottish Parliament, grow some backbone and stand up for Scotland? Mr. Speaker, the UK Government's own website states the main role of the Scottish Secretary is to promote and protect the devolution settlement. My goodness, he's been found wanting on that one. Whilst the Secretary of State has not done very well with defending devolution, he is the one that wants to kick away the legs from the agreed settlement. What a disgrace. He has been a dismal failure on living up to the definition that the Government has stated to protect devolution. The Secretary of State has ambushed devolution. At every turn, he has failed to defend the devolution settlement. Where are the amendments he promised to protect our interests? He should have told the UK Government that there must be protected time to debate the effect of the withdrawal bill on Scotland's position. He failed again. The Secretary of State for Scotland has no credibility. There is no coming back from this. He must resign, or the Prime Minister must sack him. Mr. Speaker, the EU withdrawal bill is the biggest attack on devolution we have ever witnessed. The UK Government's power grab aims to keep Scotland's powers in London, not in Scotland. As currently drafted, the legislation would keep devolved powers coming back from Brussels here in London. It is shocking. 24 powers in devolved areas like fishing, agriculture, the environment and food labelling. This, Mr. Speaker, is an absolute scandal.
Thank you very much to the right honourable member. I wonder if you'd like to comment on his party colleague Jim Sillars, who lays the blame clearly at Nicola Sturgeon's feet of a display of foolish hostility. Is that not exactly what he is doing? Does he not respect there are two governments in Scotland and the Scottish people elected two governments? Surely he must show that some respect.
Mr. Speaker, I think some of the honourable gentlemen opposite should be auditioning for Comedy Hour. Let me just remind the honourable gentlemen, the Conservatives have lost every single election in Scotland since 1955. But what they want to do is to put a veto on the Scottish Parliament and the people of our country. That's the reality. Mr. Speaker, powers must be in Scotland's hand, and it's not just the SNP that are saying it. Every party, with the exception of the Conservatives, has stood up to defend Scotland's Parliament. A recent survey by 38 Degrees showed that... My goodness, the contempt. 38 Degrees do a valuable job of making sure that our constituents keep us informed of what's important for them. But what we get is mocking contempt from the party opposite. Just keep it going. Keep it going, because people in Scotland are watching your behaviour. They're watching your behaviour. Mr. Speaker, a recent survey by 38 Degrees showed that 62% of Scots agree and want to see responsibilities over devolved areas currently held by Europe transferred straight to the Scottish Parliament. Legal experts such as Professor Rick Rawlings also criticised the EU withdrawal legislation for riding roughshod over devolution. He said, "The sooner Clause 11 of the withdrawal bill is cast aside, the better. Constitutionally maladroit, it wraps the dialogue about the role and place of the domestic market concept post-Brexit." John Downey, at the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations, has also advocated for powers to return to Scotland, not London. He said, "We have consistently pushed to enhance the powers of devolved parliaments, where it makes sense to do so, and believe more devolved powers would be better enable Scottish and Welsh ministers to react to unique regional challenges and shape tailored solutions. We feel the transfer of powers to the devolved administrations would make it easier for the sector to influence their use in a positive way." The STUC, their leader Graham Smith, has also warned The UK Government must accept the legitimacy of devolved institutions and realise that proposals which create a situation where the UK could legislate in any area of devolved competence without the agreement of the Scottish Parliament would be an erosion of devolution and would not be acceptable.
Will my honourable friend give way on that point?
I will happily give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the Tory government's re-reservation of powers and the rest of their preferred post-Brexit constitutional arrangements effectively strip the decisions about fracking from the Scottish Government? And if the decision of the future of fracking in Scotland is to be made in Whitehall, does he agree with me that the Secretary of State for Scotland's office has been permanently undermined, no matter who occupies that office?
My honourable friend makes a very valuable point. He is absolutely correct. And we have to be very careful about the threats that there are to Scotland from fracking. And of course, we should remember that Scotland is an energy-rich country. We have a wide number of different energy sources, the world leading in renewable sources, and yet we have a government in London that wants to bash ahead and risk ruining Scotland's environment. We can't stand aside and allow that to happen. I will give way.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He correctly points to 24 powers. Can he explain which ones of those create a constitutional outrage? And assuming it is some, why then did his colleagues in the Scottish Government agree to each and every one of those 24 being subject to a UK-wide framework back in December?
My goodness. Can I respectfully suggest...
It's supposed to be good.
It's supposed to be good, you've got to be kidding. Can I respectively suggest that the honourable gentleman goes back and he reads the Scotland Act 1998? Because the Scotland Act... You know, I can see people shaking their head. I can see people shaking their head, but this is actually the nub of the problem. That devolution in the Scottish Parliament is defined by that legislation. And that legislation defines what is devolved and what is reserved. And the simple fact of the matter is each of these 24 areas are devolved. They belong in the Scottish Parliament. Now, what the Scottish Government has said repeatedly, that we will sit down, we want to reach agreement with the UK Government, but that agreement has to be based on mutual respect. We will not unreasonably withhold consent on setting up framework agreements, but it has to be done on the basis of the consent of the Scottish Government and the consent of the Scottish Parliament. I cannot, for the life of me, understand why this is such a difficult concept to grab, and I have to say I am somewhat surprised and disappointed in the honourable gentleman. Mr. Speaker, last week Scotland's voices were silenced and ignored because we walked out. Is that the fact, is it? That's the fact. Well, I have to say to the honourable gentleman that what happened on Tuesday night, and it's a matter of record, he can look it up in Hansard, is that he went through the lobbies to strip the Scottish Parliament of powers, and not a single Scottish MP was allowed to debate the issue. That's the fundamental point. Mr. Speaker, the behaviour of the UK Government is disgraceful. The Conservatives really think they can do whatever they want with Scotland and get away with it. It's back to the days of the poll tax under Thatcher. The very fact that they railroaded this legislation through with no time for speeches from anyone other than the UK Government Minister shows utter contempt for Scottish democracy. Now, I regret the fact that the Secretary of State for Scotland is not down to speak tonight. I'm going to give him another opportunity. Stand up and defend the indefensible. He can't. He's sitting there playing with his iPhone, and stabbing the Scottish Parliament in the back. That's the reality. Come on, up you get. Come on, speak up. Come on, speak up.
Order. That was a sort of rhetorical device by the honourable gentleman. But it is up to the Secretary of State if he wishes to intervene. And, you know, one can't have people intervening against their will. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this speech, I suppose it can be called that by the right honourable gentleman, is not worthy of a response from me in the tone that he has set out. He calls for respect, but focuses entirely on the personal in his comments. This may be a performance for his colleagues. It may be a performance for his core voters. It doesn't impress Scotland.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what doesn't impress Scotland is a Secretary of State for Scotland that doesn't defend our Parliament. He should do the decent thing, he should do the honourable thing, he should resign, and he should do it now. Mr. Speaker, as SNP Minister Mike Russell said last week, it's been a dark day for devolution. Despite countless representations from the Scottish Government seeking to work with the UK Government to protect our interests, the intransigence of the Tory party has seen our concerns, our mitigations and our solutions blatantly disregarded and disrespected. That's the reality. While the UK Government accepted that Clause 15 of the EU withdrawal bill required the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament, when consent was not given, the UK Government decided to ignore Scotland's democratic wishes. Last week, we saw the Secretary of State for Scotland come crawling to the chamber to explain the UK Government's position after the SNP had exposed the Tory power grab. But rather than reassure the people of Scotland that the UK Government was painful, absolutely, it's painful. It's painful that the people of Scotland are seeing their powers taken back from them. But rather than reassure the people of Scotland that the UK Government was committed to protecting our devolution settlement, the Scottish Secretary's statement effectively turned Sewel on its head by saying that if there is disagreement, that is no consent on a legislative consent motion, the UK Government can proceed to legislate. Mr. Speaker, this is a cause for huge concern, and it is a pity that the Secretary of State for Scotland is clearly not that concerned, or he would have made sure he was responding in this important debate today. Under the constitutional rules, this Government should not proceed without Scotland's Parliament's consent. By constitutional convention and invariable practice since 1999, the bill should not complete its Westminster stages in its current form without that consent. Despite the murmurings of the current Secretary of State, back in 2005, the Scotland Office stated that the UK Government considered that the continuation of the Convention is vital to the success of devolution. Well, what has changed? The only thing that's changed is the Scottish Parliament hasn't given its consent, and the UK Government, showing utter disrespect, has decided to proceed.
To the Leader of the SNP. We all heard the statement that the Secretary of State gave to this House on Thursday morning. I wonder if he could give a commitment on behalf of the Scottish Government and indeed his party that if the Secretary of State was to convene cross-party talks, that his party would take part.
Yes, I mean, one of the things I would say to the, and I thank him for his intervention, one of the things I say to the honourable gentleman and to the Government across the other side, I don't believe it's in anybody's interest not to have an agreement on this. But all of us have got the responsibility of defending the powers and the interests of the Scottish Parliament. I implore the Secretary of State to get back round the table. Let's resolve this issue. I don't want us to be in the situation that the Government in London is taking back responsibility for our powers, and they really must listen to the voices which are coming from around this chamber and indeed from around Scotland. I will give way one last time.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech which I'm happy to associate myself with, but I also know from speaking to constituents of the weekend that many of them will associate themselves with these points. The sense of outrage which was coming across from constituents in my area was only the last time I saw such outrage was during the opposition to the Iraq War and to the poll tax. And does my honourable friend agree with me that Scotland House now reached a tipping point as a result of the actions of the party opposite?
My honourable friend is quite correct, and it's borne out with my own experiences over the course of the last few days. And we only have to look at the increase in membership of the Scottish National Party. And there are people coming to the SNP People that have not supported the SNP previously have not supported Scottish independence, but they are simply appalled that there's an attack on the Scottish Parliament, that there's an attack on devolution. And I'll simply say to the Secretary of State, by all means, carry on down the road that you're going on, because the people of Scotland ultimately will have to make that decision as to where their future lies. And what he's doing, as he continues to go down this road, is to help strengthen the case for Scottish independence. I suppose we should be grateful for that. Mr Speaker, last week the UK Government had a duty to amend the bill to respect the will of the Scottish Parliament. They failed to do so. Whilst SNP MPs sought to be constructive with our amendments to the legislation, we were shut out of the debate while the Tories ploughed ahead without any consideration of our proposed solution. The complete contempt shown for the people of Scotland by the Tory Government is sickening. Not only were our amendments ignored, the entire debate on devolution was allocated less than 20 minutes of discussion, with no Scottish MP allowed to speak up for their constituents. Instead, the UK Government Minister ate up all the time for himself. The Scottish Tories said they would come here to stand up for Scotland. Well, what did they do? They trooped through the lobbies to take away Scotland's powers. Theresa May's poodles whipped to vote against Scotland's interests. Scotland was aghast. The actions of the UK Government have been an affront to democracy.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I congratulate him first of all for securing the debate and also for his fantastic speech. When it's clear that in the Scottish Parliament you have the Labour Party in Scotland, the Liberal Democrats in Scotland, the SNP, the Scottish Greens on the one side and the Tories on the other, that on this issue it has become Scotland versus the Tories.
It reminds me of the line where the woman is watching her son on parade and they're saying they're all out of step apart from your Johnny, except in this case, Johnny is the Scottish Tories. Mr Speaker, when I confronted the Prime Minister over the shambolic handling of the EU withdrawal bill by her government, we were given more bluff and bluster. Mr Speaker, it is not good enough. Over the past few days, I and my party colleagues have been criticised inside this place for standing up to the Prime Minister, for making our voices heard and for standing up for the people of Scotland. Mr Speaker, let me put the Prime Minister on notice. SNP MPs will not stand by while her government seeks to rip up the rule book. This government does have an opportunity to do the right thing. With the clock ticking, we only have days left to save Scotland's devolved settlement. The solution I put to the Prime Minister last week is still on the table. That is that the Prime Minister should act immediately to bring forward emergency legislation to remove Clause 15 and Schedule 3 in line with the Scottish Parliament vote. That is the only way that the UK Government can undo the damage it has caused, and the only way that the Tories can show the people of Scotland that their Scottish Parliament's rights are recognised and respected. That is the only way that we can save devolution in Scotland. Mr Speaker, the Scottish Parliament has passed a continuity bill to protect its powers. Unbelievably, the Scottish Parliament is being taken to the Supreme Court by the UK Government over the matter. The UK Government should immediately withdraw this threat over the Scottish Parliament. Stop attacking our Parliament and start to show the Scottish Parliament some respect. The days of a UK Tory Government threatening Scotland must end. It is little wonder that the Tories once again are seen as anti-Scottish. Let me put this in a historic context. The campaign to establish the Scottish Parliament has been a long one. The Scottish Home Rule Association was established way back in 1894. There was a Scottish Government bill that passed its second reading in 1913 that would have established a Scottish Parliament with greater powers than the one that we have today. Scotland voted in a referendum for a Scottish Parliament in 1979, but the incoming Tory government refused to deliver the Scottish Parliament that Scotland had voted for. Right through the 1980s and 1990s, demand for a Scottish Parliament grew. These growing calls were ignored by the Conservatives until they were swept out of office. In 1998, the Scotland Act establishing a Scottish Parliament was passed in teeth of opposition from the Conservatives. Majority Scottish opinion demanded a Parliament. It was, as was stated, the settled will of the Scottish people. When Winning Ewing rose to address the opening of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, she said, The Scottish Parliament, which adjourned on March 25, 1707, is hereby reconvened. That Parliament that we all in these benches take pride in had its powers defined by the Scotland Act. Schedule 5 of the Act defines what areas are reserved. The UK Government also accepts, and I quote, "The Act does not specify which matters are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Rather, it specifies those matters that are reserved to the UK Parliament. Those matters not reserved by the Scotland Act are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament has primary legislative powers, i.e. the powers to pass acts." That is clear-cut. That is why, Mr Speaker, we cannot allow the Conservative Government to take back responsibility over 24 matters, which by the Scotland Act are devolved. It's wrong, and we will do everything in our power to stop it.
Honourable friend for giving way, congratulate him on a stunning speech. Does he agree with me that, as the suffragette said, we shall be judged on our deeds, not our words, and that this government will be judged and shown up for the farce that it is, and the Secretary of State will be the first Secretary of State in history, Secretary of State for Scotland, that has seen a reduction in Scottish powers to the Scottish Parliament, and that this government will be judged, and the Scottish people will not forgive, nor will they forget.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and she is absolutely correct. There is a wonderful book called The Scottish Secretaries, and it talks about some of the great and some of the not-so-great Scottish secretaries. And when you reflect on people like Tom Johnson, that did so much to transform Scottish society, and then we look at the current Secretary of State. When we look at the current Secretary of State that fails to stand up for Scotland and sees our powers taken back. Now, if you want to stand up and tell me what's personal in that, what I'm doing is I'm focusing on the fundamentals. I'm focusing on the fundamentals that his party is working against the interests of the Scottish people and the Scottish Parliament, and is, to use the phrase, taking back control. You would know. Mr Speaker, it is therefore simple. Westminster, without consent, is changing the devolution sentiment and is prepared to undermine the Scotland Act. None of us can stand back and allow this to happen. It is a point of principle. Westminster should not have a veto on the Scottish Parliament. Mr Speaker, it's pretty rich that last week we had accusations that Scotland was seeking a veto over Westminster. The Secretary of State has said that repeatedly. Let me be absolutely clear. That is not the case. All we are seeking to do is to ensure that the powers within the Scotland Act are defended, not dismantled. We have our own constitutional history, indeed, in the case of McCormick versus the Lord Advocate in 1953. When Lord Cooper gave his decision, he said, "The principle of unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctly English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. That is, that the people of Scotland are sovereign. Westminster must respect the will of the Scottish Parliament through its members having been elected by the people of Scotland. I should remind the UK Government that they have lost every single election in Scotland since 1955, and it's hardly surprising. The Conservatives are isolated in the Scottish Parliament and not standing up to defend our default rights. Isolated. Mr Speaker, this is not about the SNP, it is about the settled will of the Scottish people and of the Scottish Parliament. History will judge all of us on our actions, and at this time of critical and a challenging time. Therefore, I say to every Scottish MP in this place, do not fall on the wrong side. I say to the Secretary of State, stop hiding out and instead stand up with us and stand up for Scotland's Parliament. Stop the power grab or go down as the Secretary of State that allows Scotland's Parliament to have its powers reduced. History will remember the defining moment when this Parliament chose to reject devolution, when the Tories chose to stand almost 10 years of constitutional convention only to tell the people of Scotland that their voices would be silenced. But I say again, there is a choice before the UK Government. Act now to bring in emergency legislation to recognise the Scottish Parliament and to protect our devolved settlement. Anything less risks constitutional crisis. Mr Speaker, we are days away The clock is ticking. The government must act. I urge the government to choose to be on the right side of history, do the right thing by the people of Scotland and bring forward emergency legislation immediately to delete Clause 15 and Schedule 3 to protect Scottish devolution in our Scottish Parliament. In closing,